In this video about making Calvin's desk, I'm going to work on and make the legs. In designing the legs, I went through a few different options. One of the things I toyed with was doing a cruciform column type of leg where it's cut into the cone shape that I was working with. But I liked the curve on the corner of the desk, and I liked how that worked with a cylindrical column. So I ended up with a wood-turned cone-shaped column. And I decided to do it with segmented pieces on the top and then a more solid piece on the bottom. So I'm going to make two legs, and one of the legs will be cut in half, and those will be attached to the drawer box. And the second leg will float under the desktop. I'll start by making all the segmented pieces for the two legs. So I need to cut a bunch of strips from this piece of English walnut, as well as a piece of black walnut. Once I get the strips cut, they then need to be jointed and planed, so that the strips have the same section throughout their length. So as I cut the segmented pieces, they'll all be the same width and thickness. So I need, each leg is going to have 16 rings, and each ring has 8 pieces. That's going to give me 148 pieces per leg, or 296 total pieces. Each ring of 8 pieces is going to be 6 pieces of English walnut and 2 pieces of black walnut. And then I'll spiral the black pieces as they go up the column. It'll give it a twisting look. With my jig set up, the pieces went relatively quickly. I had two methods for gluing these, where I would glue up each half and then shim the two halves together, so that each half had nice tight joints. And in one method I used rubber bands to clamp the smaller rings together, and the larger rings I glued and shimmed between the two halves, and then used my band clamps to hold them together as the glue dried. And both methods worked pretty well. Then I had to sand the joint between the two halves to make them parallel, and glue all of the halves together, which took, I think, every single one of my clamps and some rubber bands. But then I had all of my rings together. Back to the sander, I had to sand all the faces of the rings so that the rings could be glued to each other with a tight joint between each ring. I started down the road of building a press and a whole contraption for gluing up all these rings, but then I realized I could just do it on the lathe. So I tried that by mounting a faceplate to the biggest ring and making some plates that would help hold the rings together. And I just used the tailstock to apply pressure to the glue joint. I gave each pressure plate a center, and I draw a circle on the preceding ring and lay out the new ring and get it adjusted by eye, and then just apply pressure with the tailstock. Next, I needed to make the bottom black walnut piece for the two legs. So I did this by cutting out pieces of black walnut that I then glued together to make a quasi-solid piece for the bottom. Even though this is made up of parts and technically, yes, it's segmented, I wanted it to look like it's a solid piece of walnut with no pattern between the pieces. So I made two big chunks. I needed to connect the segmented section to the solid section, so I needed a very flat end, and I also wanted to put a wooden pin in the center to help hold that joint together. So I drilled a hole in both the segmented piece and the solid piece, and then connected them with a dowel. I tried sanding the end to get it flat, but that just really didn't work. It still gave me a convex shape. It wasn't really flat. So I ended up using a scraper very carefully on the end of this long cantilevered piece. But that worked, and I got a nice flat connection. I cleaned up the solid piece and cut the corners off so the turning would go a little quicker. I needed to do the same process on this, where I flatten up the end and drill a hole for the pin connection. And I didn't bother trying to sand this one because I knew that wasn't going to work. So I carefully used the scraper. So this is how it would go together, the pin. And then those two faces match up. So I just add some glue and do the same process with the lathe, where I just use the lathe as a press to hold the glue together as it cures. Looks good. So now I need to turn the two legs down. And this was actually a lot of fun because it was big like turning a bowl, but there was no inside work. It was all on the exterior. So it went really quickly, and it was a lot of fun. It's basically turning a great big spindle. And I did some sanding. And they came out really nice. I pulled the faceplate off and realized, hey, it's a Vuvuzela!
What's he doing now?
I needed to make sure they were the same length, so I used my level to figure that out. Now I need to cut one of them in half. So what I decided to make was a jig for my bandsaw bowl cutting jig. And the jig is basically a cradle to hold the leg secure as it's cut by the bandsaw. So it needs to be exactly the same length as the leg to hold it in place. This is how it goes together. And then the leg sits inside. And I'll put it together here. I started with nails, and then I ended up adding some screws. Now I was nervous about this cut, so I did a practice run with a 2x4 just to make sure it would work. I set it up so the sides of the jig line up with the blade on the bandsaw, so that I know where the blade and thus where the cut's going to be as I'm putting the workpiece into the jig. And it worked. We're getting closer to the moment of truth, and I attached the leg to the jig with some screws, and I could get it adjusted to exactly where I wanted the cut to be. Almost ready? Almost ready? Nope. And one more adjustment. I'm not quite ready. And now we'll start the cut. And it ended up, this wood is obviously nicer than the 2x4, so the blade actually made this cut straighter than it did on the 2x4, which is what I was hoping for. It actually worked. It actually worked better than my practice cut, which is good. I've sped this up by 200%, so it's a little bit faster than actually making the cut. And it worked. Now I can just pull the half that's still in the jig off. Now the second problem I had is I needed to make that cut surface smooth. And I realized cutting end grain on the joiner is a huge no-no. But with this Shelix head that I have in the joiner and taking very, very light passes, it worked. So with lots and lots of passes, I managed to get that cut surface smooth. The last thing that I need to do to these legs is attach a little piece that goes under the drawer section to make the column look as though it's round and not just a sliced in half column that it is. So I add a little piece of black walnut at the bottom of each of the legs. And it's 5¼ inches. It's the height that the drawers are going to be above the floor. You can see the twisting pattern on the leg. I then have to turn this piece on the leg on the lathe. And this was another thing I was a little bit worried about, but it ended up working great. Notice the face shield. And I sanded it. And here we have the legs. Okay, so there are the legs. The one that we cut in half will be against the drawer box, and the one that we didn't will float out here under the desktop, and there'll be a desktop here, and there'll be a back here, and we'll do that next time. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.